Rawl needed mowing again. I stood at the edge of the driveway, staring at it, because looking at the lawn was easier than looking at my son's face when he opened the front door and said, "Mom's not ready yet." He was 14. He had my jaw and his mother's eyes, and the kind of expression that told me he already knew how this visit was going to go. "I'll wait out here," I said. He disappeared back inside without another word. I heard the door close, and then I heard music. The kind of music my nephew Marcus listened to. The kind I didn't recognize anymore. That was new. A year ago, my son Tyler would have stayed on the porch to talk to me. He would have told me about his baseball practice, about the video he watched, about anything. Now he went back inside. I had 48 hours with my kids every other weekend. 2 days, 48 hours every 2 weeks, while my brother lived in my house, slept down the hall for my children, and apparently had opinions about lawn care that I no longer had any say in. I leaned against my truck and waited. "My name is Michael. I'm 41 years old. I work in logistics for a distribution company in Columbus, Ohio, and for 11 years I was married to a woman named Diane. Diane was smart and funny and patient in ways I never fully appreciated until those qualities were being directed at someone else. We had 2 kids together, Tyler, now 14, and our daughter Chloe, who was 11. We had a house in the suburbs, a dog named Peanut who died 2 years before all of this, and a brother of mine named Greg who came over for dinner every Sunday and called my wife Di, like they'd known each other their whole lives. They had. Greg was 2 years younger than me. Growing up, we were close. Not best friends, but close in the way brothers are when there's no one else around. He was the better-looking one, the charming one, the one my mother introduced to her friends first at family gatherings. I used to joke about it. I stopped joking the night Diane sat me down in the kitchen and told me she'd been in love with Greg for over a year and that she wanted a divorce. I asked her to say it again. She said it again. I remember thinking very clearly, the dishes are still in the drying rack. She washed them before this conversation. She washed the dishes, put them in the rack to dry, and then came to tell me she was in love with my brother. For some reason, that detail stayed with me longer than it should have. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I sat there and asked questions I didn't want answers to, and she gave me answers I hadn't asked for. They hadn't done anything physical, she said. She'd been trying to fight it. She didn't want to hurt me. She thought it was better to be honest. Greg called me the next morning. He said he was sorry. I told him not to come to my house again, and I hung up. He called back. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that said he never meant for this to happen and that I was his brother and he loved me. I deleted it. 3 months later, he was living in my house. I didn't understand how that happened so fast. Looking back, I understand it better. The legal system moves faster than grief does. Diane got temporary custody of the kids and the house. I got a 2-bedroom apartment 20 minutes away and every other weekend. My lawyer told me we had similar incomes and that the arrangement was standard. I told him the arrangement was a punishment for something I hadn't done. He nodded like he'd heard that before and went back to his paperwork. What made it worse, and I know how that sounds because it already sounds as bad as it can get, was Tyler. My son decided, somewhere in those first 6 months, that Greg was the one he wanted to talk to. Greg coached his baseball team. Greg had the big TV and a PlayStation that I hadn't been able to afford yet because I was paying rent on an apartment I hadn't chosen while also covering my share of the mortgage. Greg made the kind of money that let him buy things without checking the account first. The first time Tyler called him Uncle Greg in front of me, I let it go. The second time I said something, I kept my voice level. I asked Diane privately what she was doing, and she said the kids needed stability and that Greg was a stable presence, and that she hadn't told them to call him anything. They'd decided on their own. He was their uncle, after all. I drove home that night at 9 miles under the speed limit because I didn't trust myself. I sat in my apartment parking lot for 20 minutes before I could go inside. I told myself it would get easier. It didn't get easier. What happened instead was that I got quieter. I stopped calling my parents as much because every conversation circled back to Greg, to how hard he was trying, to how we were all family, and family had to find a way through. My mother cried on the phone once and told me she didn't want to lose either of her sons. I told her she hadn't lost me. She didn't want to lose either of her sons. I don't know if I believed it. At work I was fine. Work was the one place where nobody knew about Greg or Diane or the 2-bedroom apartment. I was just Michael from logistics, who knew the distribution routes by heart, and always had the regional numbers ready before the Tuesday meetings. My manager offered me a project lead position, and I took it, partly because I needed the income and partly because staying late meant not going home to silence. The worst weekend happened in April, about a year and a half after the divorce. It's my weekend with the kids. I drove to the house, knocked, and Tyler answered the door and said they weren't coming. What do you mean you're not coming? Uncle Greg's taking us to the Reds game. It's a doubleheader. Tyler, it's my weekend. He looked at me the way teenagers look at you when they're embarrassed for you. Dad, it's a doubleheader. We already have the tickets. Diane appeared behind him. She looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. She said she'd thought I'd understand, that it was a special occasion, that she'd let me make it up another time. I stood on my own porch, in front of my own front door, and listened to my wife explain why my brother had my kids on my weekend. I said fine. I said I'd talk to them when they got back. I walked to my truck, got in, and drove to a bar I'd never been to before, which was something I hadn't done since college, and I sat there for 3 hours and had 4 beers and drove home under the speed limit again, barely. I called my friend Dennis that night. Dennis worked in IT and had been divorced for 5 years and had a way of saying exactly the wrong thing that somehow still made me feel less alone. He told me I needed to stop being the guy who waits in driveways. I told him I didn't know how to be any other guy. He said that was the problem. I didn't sleep much after that. Something shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing you could point to, but a quiet, slow shift, like a house settling into different ground. I started working out, not because of some movie-style montage or self-improvement, but because I needed somewhere to put the anger that wouldn't get me in trouble. I went to the gym at 6 in the morning, 3 days a week, and I stopped keeping beer in the apartment. I called Tyler and Chloe every night, even when they didn't have much to say. I listened to them talk about school and their friends and the things they were watching, and I didn't ask about Greg, and I didn't make them feel like they were being watched for clues. Chloe called me one Tuesday night and talked for 40 minutes about a book she was reading. It was the first time in months I went to bed without the feeling like I'd been hollowed out from the inside. I started paying attention to the details of my own life again. I reorganized the apartment. I learned to cook 3 things properly instead of badly cooking everything. I got a gym membership for Tyler for his birthday, and we went together twice before he admitted he'd rather play basketball at the park, so we did that instead. We didn't always talk much at the park. We didn't need to. 6 months after the Reds game incident, I transferred to the regional office in Cincinnati. It wasn't running away. It was something Dennis said. He asked me why I was building my life in the shadow of someone else's house. I didn't have a good answer. The Cincinnati transfer came up and I took it. The commute from Columbus to my kids was the same hour whether I was coming from an apartment I hated or a city I might actually like. I found a good apartment. I found a gym closer to work. I found a coffee shop that opened at 5:30 where the woman behind the counter remembered what I ordered after the 3rd visit. Her name was Renata. She was Polish-American, 37, and recently out of a long engagement that she described, very calmly, as an education. She was not someone I was looking for. I was not, at that point, looking for anyone. She started staying to talk after handing over my coffee when the shop wasn't busy. We talked about logistics and the city and the particular loneliness of starting over in your late 30s in a place where nobody has any context for who you used to be. She said that part was actually a relief. I said I was starting to understand that. I asked her to dinner on a Thursday morning in November. She said yes before I finished the sentence. We took it slowly. I told her about Diane and Greg on the 2nd date, not to unload, but because she asked about my kids and I didn't want to explain the situation piecemeal over several months. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "That's your brother." Just those 3 words, the same way someone might say, "That's a house fire," while watching from across the street. I said yes. She said, "Okay, tell me about your kids." I talked about Tyler and Chloe until the restaurant closed. Renata had no children and had wanted them and was honest about that from the beginning. She was straightforward in ways I hadn't known to appreciate the first time around. She said what she thought. She apologized when she was wrong and expected the same in return. Being with her didn't feel like learning to swim. It felt like I'd forgotten I already knew how. I flew back to Columbus for Christmas that year. Tyler and Chloe were with me for Christmas Eve and Christmas morning. We made pancakes and watched movies, and Tyler beat me twice at the video game he'd asked for, which I had actually managed to get before Greg this time. It was small. It was enough. On Christmas afternoon, I drove the kids back to the house. Diane answered the door, and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel anything specific when I saw her. No anger, no grief. Just the neutral acknowledgement that this was the mother of my children and we had logistics to coordinate. She said, "They had a good time?" I said they did. She nodded and started to close the door, and then she stopped. She said, "Greg and I are having some problems. I wanted you to know in case the kids say something." I stood there. I thought about everything I could have said. Then I said, "Let me know if it affects pickup times." I walked back to my truck. I felt fine. I felt better than fine. I felt like a man who had finally walked out of a room he'd been standing in for 2 years wondering when someone would come let him out. I told Renata about it that night on the phone. She laughed. Not cruelly, just that short, clear laugh she had when something confirmed a theory. She said, she wanted to see how you'd react. I said I knew. She said, how did it feel? I said, like nothing, which felt great. In February, my mother called. She said Greg and Diane were separating. She said it in a very careful voice, like she was delivering a diagnosis, waiting to see where I'd fall. I told her I hoped everyone would be okay and that I had a meeting in 10 minutes. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "You sound different, Michael." I said I was. She said, "Good different?" I said, "I think so." Spring came and Renata flew to Columbus to meet Tyler and Chloe. I had been nervous about it for 2 weeks. Tyler was politely indifferent in the way 14-year-old boys are politely indifferent about most adult matters. And then Renata mentioned she'd grown up near the stadium where his favorite pitcher had started his career and spent 20 minutes answering every single question he had about it. And after that he was fine. Chloe was easier. She decided in the first hour that Renata's earrings were the best earrings she'd ever seen, and that was that. We went to dinner and then bowling, which I am genuinely terrible at, and Renata was worse, and Tyler found this deeply satisfying. On the drive back to the hotel, Chloe fell asleep against Renata's shoulder. I watched it happen in the rearview mirror. I didn't say anything. I just drove. That night, after the kids were asleep, Renata and I sat on the hotel balcony and she asked me if I was okay. I said I was more than okay. She said she knew that, but she was asking anyway because she wanted to hear me say it. I said I was more than okay. She said, "Good, because I need to tell you something." She had found out 3 days before the trip. She'd been trying to figure out how to bring it up without it overshadowing the visit. She was pregnant, about 7 weeks. She said she understood if it was too fast, too much, that we didn't have to make any decisions tonight, that she'd meant what she said about going slowly and this changed the timeline whether she wanted it to or not. I asked her if she wanted to keep it. She said yes, very quietly, like she hadn't been sure she was allowed to want that. I took her hand. I told her that 7 weeks wasn't that far from where I'd hoped we'd end up, just faster. She laughed in that short, clear way. I told her I'd been thinking about asking her to move in with me for the last 2 months and had been working up to it. She said that seemed like useful information to have had earlier. I said I was making up for lost time. We got married in August. Small. Dennis is my best man. Renata's sister and her mother from Krakow who cried through the whole thing and then danced better than anyone at the reception. Tyler gave a speech that was funny and awkward in exactly the right way. And Chloe wore a dress she'd picked out herself and looked exactly like the person she was going to grow up to be. Our son was born in October. We named him Daniel. He had Renata's nose and her coloring and, according to Dennis, my complete inability to sleep in. Tyler was at the hospital. He held Daniel for about 30 seconds, looked genuinely terrified, handed him back and said, "He's really small." Chloe cried and didn't apologize for it. I was 41 years old, standing in a hospital room in Cincinnati with a woman who told me the truth from the beginning and a son who was 7 hours old. And my daughter was crying and my son was pretending he wasn't moved by it. And I thought about the lawn at the old house and the drying rack and the 2-day every other weekend arithmetic of a life that had come apart. I thought about my brother who was now living in an apartment of his own, navigating the same logistics I'd learned the hard way. I didn't think about it long. Dennis brought food to the hospital. Actual good food from the Italian place on 5th, not the cafeteria, and we ate in the room while Daniel slept in the bassinet and Renata laughed at something Dennis said, and the late October light came through the window at an angle that made everything look like it had been arranged by someone who knew what they were doing. I don't know who that someone was. I don't have a tidy way to close this out. I'm not the kind of person who finds meaning in suffering or believes that everything happens for a reason. I think sometimes things just happen and then you decide who you're going to be about it and you live with that decision every day until it becomes just who you are. I know who I am now. I know it in the morning when Daniel wakes up at 5:30 and I'm the one who gets up because Renata was up at 2 and I know the math of exhaustion better than I used to. I know it when Tyler calls me on a Tuesday night for no reason. I know it when Chloe asks if she can bring a friend to Cincinnati for a weekend visit and I say yes before she finishes asking. I know it when I drive past a house with a lawn that needs mowing and feel nothing at all except the straightforward appreciation of a man who no longer has to stand in that driveway wondering when someone is coming out.